And then the quick little introduction. My name is Dolores Perez, and I'm currently the president of University of Michigan MANRRS. And our amazing Vice President Sean is going to be giving you a quick introduction about tonight's event. You want to take it away, Sean?
For sure. Hi, everyone. So today is for Conchas and Conversations, and we have three special guests, Michelle Martinez, Raquel Garcia, and Jose Gonzalez. A little bit about Michelle. Michelle is the coordinator for the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, is a Latinx mestiza environmental justice activist. Raquel Garcia is the executive director for SDEV, better known as Southwest Detroit Environmental Vision, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to improve the environment and strengthen the economy of Southwest Detroit. And then last but not least, we have Jose Gonzalez, who is the founder and director of Emeritus of Latino Outdoors. He is an experienced educator as a K-12 public education teacher, environmental education advisor, and outdoor education instructor and coordinator.
Great. Well, thank you. And again, hello and welcome. And just a little bit of a disclosure, I am actually looking at the questions. And so if there's a question in the chat, please someone flag that so that I can kind of look at all of the different ideas we have today on the table. Again, my name is Raquel Garcia. I joined SDEV as the director in October 2019. Previously, I was on the board and worked at a couple of other organizations in Southwest Detroit. And so, I mean, this is a really exciting conversation. It's a conversation, not a panel. We've got 2 hours, and so I think we can dive deep into some of these questions. And I think we'd love to just really begin with just starting with like, for example, intersectionality. We're in the environmental field. I'm new to the field, so I'm really curious. I'd love to kind of back up and ask this question of Michelle and Jose. If they could tell us more about their organization, you know, what are the campaigns that you're working on? You know, what do we need to know about your organizations? How did you get to the organization? What do you love about your job? And you've got a captured audience here with you today. What kind of help do you need from us? And what would you like to see? If we could do one thing with each organization or 3 things, what would those be? So that's kind of the first question. Who wants to kick off?
Defer to you first, Michelle.
I was trying to kick it to you first and I was on mute. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Michelle Martinez. I use she and her pronouns and I live in Detroit, Michigan. Thanks for joining tonight. I feel like there's so much going on all the time that we're being pulled in many, many different directions. And it's rare that we get to like just sit and reflect and think about what the things that we want to manifest are and do that intentionally and collectively. So, you know, just grateful for you to sit here and, you know, if there's time, I'd love to hear from some of the folks on the call too. And thanks to those who organized this tonight. So Dolores, thank you. I want to learn more about your path and others who reached out. Raquel, thank you too for the welcome. A lot of questions there. I'll say that right now I work with an organization called Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. And, you know, it really came out of the environmental justice movement in a way that I'm just so humbled and honored to be a part of. Some of the movement leaders like Donnell Wilkins, Rhonda Anderson, Paul Mohai, Catherine Savoy, and so many others who have been doing this work for quite some time, you know, and who are movement elders really helped formulate the EJ principles and really founded some of the foundational research now that we call environmental justice through the work at SEAS, and previously known as SNRE. And we're putting political pressure on the state of Michigan in 2004, 2005, 2006. A lot of people may not know that in Detroit during this period, in a post-NAFTA, post-9/11 situation, the international border, it was and was really a crossroads turning point, as the international border, right, the largest border, the fastest and most trafficked international crossing on the northern border with Canada, and the industry around us were growing along with the economy, right? So there were big fights that were happening around expanding the international border. There were proposals to build tunnels and bridges and expand the port and expand the intermodal freight terminals. And our communities in Southwest Detroit were really struggling under the weight of what looked like yet another phase of really heavy industry coming into the community without any sense of protections, right? And, you know, some of you who are students of environmental law will know that, you know, the Clean Air Act in its original form was just not protective enough. And even in its updating in the 1990s was not protective enough to consider that, you know, 16,000 semi-trucks were coming through our neighborhoods every day. So it was not a small amount of traffic, right? So, you know, some of our movement leaders were really pushing on the administration during this time to get an environmental justice plan, and they succeeded in getting then Governor Jennifer Granholm to sign an executive directive to put in place an environmental justice plan. You know, unfortunately, in the 11th hour of the administration, that plan was totally gutted by industry and by, I mean, when I say industry, I want to be really specific, right? Like Detroit is the motor city, right? So we have the automotive industry, we have Michigan Manufacturers Association, we have the Chamber, we have Michigan Mining Association, we have big, big money, right? Multi-generational corporate forces that are very powerful. So we unfortunately lost a lot at that time, but we really came back to the table in 2011. That's when I became involved with what we call MEJC 2.0, asking like, hey, who's this guy Snyder? Like, do we think that he might be amenable to some of the environmental justice things that Granholm had put in? And, you know, it was a really fascinating time because we were sitting with folks who, like, I even hate to say their name, but like, you know, we were talking to Bryce Feiner, for example, who was one of the architects of what we now know as the Flint water crisis, right? But negotiating with him and asking like, hey, like, do you think we could set up environmental justice metrics and this and this and that? And they were saying things to us like, yeah, absolutely, we'll get you that information and no problem. And yeah, we'll do this. And 2 and 3 and 4 months passed, 5 months of us going to these meetings and getting absolutely no quality information that they were promising each meeting, no substantive commitments to the things that they were promising. So with the right hand sort of meeting with us, and with the left hand fast tracking industrial permits, permitting for Marathon Oil, permitting for Severstal Steel, 725 times the legal limits of pollution permitting. It was pretty egregious. So that's the long story. And what we ended up saying is that, like, you know, we need to know, like, and build our environmental justice movement in Michigan, right? Like, who across the state of Michigan is doing this? And we started having statewide summits. We have them every 2 years. And what we found is that there's 10 people in a church basement all over the state of Michigan fighting a Goliath, right? Fighting for clean water, fighting against a fracked gas plant, fighting against a pipeline, fighting against a mine, fighting for their lives. And so Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition is just one effort of many, many, many people across the state who seek to align for environmental justice and push back on, these narratives that this is just the sacrifice that we have to make for industry to continue to produce. And so we hope to be a political home for narratives that, our lives actually matter, Black and brown lives matter, and continue to do that through several different campaigns. So I'm exhausted by hearing my own voice, so I'm going to pass the mic to Jose. And I'll be happy to talk about our campaigns too. But yeah, what are you doing, Jose? How's California?
Oh, thank you. I always appreciate the conversational nature of your space, Michelle. And to me, I'm treating this as I say this in the best sense of the word, a lecture for my own learning. And then I'll add some humor, because back when we were at then SNRE, to me, like, Michelle was the cool second year student, right? Now it's just like the freshman, if you will, in the graduate program. So I love listening to kind of see how the work carries on. And on my end, first of all, saludos everybody I'm calling you all in from ancestral traditional stolen lands of the Maidu Miwok in Northern California, among many others communities, currently Sacramento. We'll also say this is kind of Sacrastlan in the sense of Sacramento Califas, for if there's any Chicanos in the audience. But it also is just a layer in terms of that, what I call a contemporary mestizaje of the word, because I also very want to be intentional with that word in terms of its history and its current use, and then kind of what I envision for it with the future and others. And I share that because in terms of like, what do I do now in that sense? And when you asked about the organization, so sometime after leaving Michigan, I had this idea in terms of similar to, I think, everybody here is, where are there others like me? And part of that work was to be able to say, there's this aspect of my Latino, Latinx, even just Mexican identity that cares about the environment, cares about the outdoors, cares about conversation. This is why I went to graduate school. This is why I was like trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And eventually at that time, there were a few other people also kind of figuring out similar spaces. And so I zeroed in on kind of the outdoor component, because I thought that in some ways I was even more of an outlier, because it's in the main, environmental at large, and even conservation, you've had people that have been doing this work, of course, and that in some ways, it was, I don't want to say easier because that's not the right word, but it might have been clearer to connect to environmental justice, which was to me like also where I wanted to ground my work. But the outdoors was even much more of this white space, outdoor recreation. It was like, that's all the nice to do. Those are all, what does it mean to, it was overly captured by ideas like camping and hiking and all of this stuff, which I liked. But it was still that sense of like, you feel like you leave your cultura at the trailhead, we would say. Oh, all of a sudden we're going hiking. It's almost like, great, now I have to change my tone of voice, or what the food that I'm going to be carrying, the mannerisms, how you're received in this space, and the clothing. And I knew that to me, it was more than that. So I'm sharing that because it was like the push to create this thing we ultimately call Latino Outdoors. And that was strategic in the use of those words as well, as a way to eventually engage and kind of challenge entities like the National Park Service, for example, as well as the outdoor industry. And that became my job. So essentially created my own job and figured that out. That wasn't my intention. And no way did I ever want to say, yay, who wants to start a nonprofit? I think those of us that work in nonprofit understand the challenges enough of just working in them. But it worked enough to create the sense of community and to be able to have a space and a platform for others to kind of say, hey, if we feel like I'm the only one, this can be a space that we can connect. And so that allowed for me to do a lot of wayfinding, a lot of figuring out, a lot of testing, a lot of like building that space to bring some of the, I don't say tougher and challenging because that's a matter of perspective, but needed conversations around equity, around justice, around what inclusive practices mean, especially as people were asking the diversity question, which is like, how do we get more people of color to engage in this space or care about the outdoors, so be more connected to nature, that kind of stuff. So went through that, and that was kind of my part of my 5-year plan that I had cobbled up together at the moment, and saying, I want to see if I can create something, and what does that mean? And it ended up aligning just enough that developed a transition and succession plan, and left as the founding executive director about 1.5 years or 2 now ago. We hired a new executive director, got that set up so that I could have more space in which to even broaden the ideas, play with do a lot of more direct work around quote unquote equity and inclusion and justice oriented work, a lot of facilitation, design. So I'm still essentially senior advisor to the executive director and the board. I'm a volunteer. I support in policy work. So we just, something we're extremely proud of is that Latino Outdoors was the sponsoring nonprofit to a bill in California for outdoor equity access. And through everything, right, not just Fortune, but through the alliances, we in coordination and the community building and the relationship building, we got $20 million to be put forth in this outdoor equity fund to be able, yes, I think I want to also say saludos. To the, to be able to provide funding for organizations that really wanted a centered equity and inclusion as part of this outdoor nature access, especially for communities that weren't by default getting that. So that's kind of where we are today. So I wear a mix of hats at the moment to be able to say, this is how I support the space that I helped create and that I want to take responsibility and care for to continue, because it provided the platform for a lot of unseen leadership. It wasn't that it wasn't there already. The leaders were already there. But all of a sudden people are like, how did you discover? I'm like, let's stop. You're Columbusing this idea, right? Like as if all of a sudden they needed to be discovered. You just never noticed and you never supported. And then the other 2 hats, of course, is for me, what does it mean to enter some of these spaces of access and even privilege so that I'm aware of the tokenizing components while also understanding if I can have any leveraging that provides access and leaves the space more accessible than from when I started. So that means like serving on boards, serving on certain committees, like serving in those kind of spaces that take a lot of emotional labor. They take a lot of fatigue. They take a lot of navigation. They take a lot of doubt. They take a lot of things to say, right? Why am I here? But that's why I still have to have those questions guide me to be able to be in service of what. And then I couple that with this feeling of, I remember what it was like to be in grad school and say, what do I want to do with this? Why am I here? And then after that, where do I actually want to work? What kind of do I want to do? So Raquel, when you ask kind of I forgot what the question was in terms of what brings us joy or what's fun about it. What's fun about it is the same thing that makes it challenging and difficult, that I now, at this moment, I get to create my own schedule. Right. But then that means I create my own schedule. So that means that I have to constantly be balancing what to do to pay the bills in a way that isn't just, in service of white spaces, while also acknowledging that those are the spaces that I need to change to be able to do some of this. And that this is part of a blessing that I know my parents also didn't get. What it means to be a professional in this space. I'm an immigrant from Mexico, so to be able to honor all of that work that they put in there, because the whole idea of being here is to quote unquote do better, so to speak. So that's also, I'll pause myself there because there's a lot we can unpack, but I'm grateful to be here with all of you.
Okay, I was on mute. That is a lot to unpack, and it brings me a lot of joy because, you know, I can, you know, I'm 50 something. And so every time I think about, you know, bad bosses and what does that really mean? It's usually like a structure or ideas, power and control. And, you know, somebody that had that over me or other people. And for the majority of my life, that has not been people of color over me. That's been, you know, usually a white male. And so for me, when I became executive director, first of all, I was frightened. So Jose, when you talk about like, what does this mean? Can I do it? Do I do it? All the doubt and questions come from a colonial space, right? Like, can I mimic those things that I was taught that are the standard? And so I had similar questions, like, can I come into a space and decide for us as a team that we are discarding a lot that we don't need and that does not serve? And so, you know, we have these discussions almost daily. Like, we're like, why do we do that? Do we need that? Like, is that important? You know, like we just have these like constant rooting up of what does it mean? Where, you know, and rediscovering the things, the really complicated things, you know. For example, I'm looking at Dolores's beautiful list of questions, and on the one hand, I've always been really connected to my mom's garden in San Antonio, Texas, and like connected to her pomegranate trees and just connected to the earth in a different way that I've seen my counterparts. But then we are also connected to the earth through like stereotype, you know, like I've had phone calls like, do you know any landscapers? Like, just, you know, yes, maybe no, but why do you assume that, you know, about me? You know, like what about me in the neighborhood I live in makes you say that? And so just staying with, you know, what you were mentioning, especially in this space of environmental justice and environmentalism. One of the things I felt most intimidated coming into this job was, you know, that there is an image attached to this. Like, it's an image of usually a scientist man, you know, somebody who's really educated, like using words that I can understand. And I really had a lot of doubt. And so we, you know, recently I was in a discussion where they talked about how does this space get owned by a certain community, a type of community. And really the question, I guess, the question I'm trying to ask is, how do we unpack it so that everybody can own it? So that young people and all people of color, and just ask them to you know, how do we get them to feel included, and how do we get them to demand a seat at the table, and how would you both characterize, like, do you feel there's a lot of access? Do you feel it's still, you know, someone's like watching the gate on this? Like, do you feel like it's easy to enter the space? And what is your advice for someone who is thinking about coming into the space and feels that they need to get a degree first to join, you know, to come aboard? Like, what would you say to somebody who's got all these questions?
That's what I say. Well, you know, certainly, like, there's no linear path, right? You know, so there's a lot there, and I think there's the personal side, and then there's the like organizational side and the movement side, right? And you know, for me, it's like the work is so much about like the personal journey, right? You know, I grew up in Southwest Detroit, And then when I was very young, we moved to rural Michigan, right? We moved to a town called Howell, Michigan. And immediately when people hear that, folks who are from Michigan go, holy shit, you're from Howell, Michigan. And I'm like, no, I'm not from Howell, Michigan. I lived in Howell, Michigan for 10 years. And people are shocked because it's the historic home of the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, Robert Miles, who lived there in Cohocton until his death in 1994. And so there was, I would say, a presence of the Klan, an active presence. And when I was a teenager in high school, when Robert Miles died, the Klan sort of had a coming out party, right? Like, hey, y'all, like, Robert Miles is dead, but the Klan is not dead. And how my family adapted was certainly by hiding, right? Hiding who we were, making sure that we were assimilating, conforming, but also spatially hiding, right? So that's part of how I came to love nature, right? Because on the weekends, what I would do is me and my two friends would go into the woods, right? And we would play and fly kites and go to parks and hang out in rural spaces where we felt safe away from toxic social interactions, right? And so I think in each of our stories, as we begin to think about what that like very visceral connection is to Earth, is where we find that purpose. And the land itself actually has this amazing healing power to be able to talk to us and hold us, even when we are not looking for that, or don't know that we're in the midst of that. I certainly get some of this from my parents, right, who are lovers of nature, and we come from farming traditions, right, and indigenous traditions, and also traditions of mass displacement, right, where turning back to the land was something I think that our family just in an unspoken way connected, right? So I didn't grow up camping, right? Like, I didn't know what the Sierra Club even was until I got a job there, right? Like these organizations or institutions had no interface with my life, right? Instead, I grew up thinking about nature as like, oh, we have big barbecues in the backyard with 200 of my cousins, and we salsa dance until 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. Like, that's where like joy happened, right? Is in open spaces and open places. And when I would go back and forth between Detroit, right, a majority Black city that was undergoing mass disinvestment, and the country where, you know, my family were actively in different ways hiding, right, to maintain our social connectivity and surviving in the Latinx diaspora. The disparities of the even ability to connect to nature, to walk, to feel safe. What did different formations of safety mean, right? And the ultimate privilege, right, of feeling majesty and feeling so safe that you can imagine majesty, right? In just amazing sacred places, just became so astounding to me that, you know, that is the place where our soul grows, right? And, you know, as it relates to work, the work there is, how do we fight so that everybody can have that, right? That, you know, breathing the air in your own community is killing you, right? And that, you know, walking around isn't even an option, right? Going out of your house because you might get, you know, scooped up by ice, or you might get, you know, get involved in something that you didn't intend to get involved in, right? And so that disparity is so astounding, right? And so how do we create good governance structures that don't replicate the institutions that created the possibility of that harm, right? So when we talk about like uprooting racism, uprooting systemic oppression, you know, I often say like, you have to look at the behavior of the institutions themselves and how they create the conditions for that to actually exist, right? Like that's what we're fighting, right? Is the root cause of some of these issues. And some of the ways that we fight back on that is by creating models of good governance, right? What does collective decision making look like, right? What does it mean to say no, right? What does it mean to hold and lock arms and ask for, you know, something that we deserve, right? And not be cast off as like a radical or a troublemaker, but really standing in your dignity and saying no. How can we do that in a good way that is also intersectional, right? So when I talk about, you know, environmental justice through, you know, my own experience in the LatinX community, people are like, oh, what's going on in the Latinx community? How come, you know, like the environmental justice movement isn't like really so important for Latinos? And I'm like, y'all, can we talk about ICE for a minute? Because we live on the border. And the number one thing that people have been fighting against and mobilizing is like deportation. And so when we're talking about like where, when people ask, so where are the Latinos at? I'm like, fighting to stay together, fighting to stay in our homes, right? And that is a more immediate threat than a cancer you might get in 30 years, right? Or a climate change impact that you might be experiencing down the line, right? And so a lack of an intersectional analysis will always lead us to question, you know, a singular aspect and consider it as a failure, when the intersectional analysis allows us to like fight on multiple fronts at one time. And I think that being in community and being in solidarity demands that. And it's a longer fight, right? When people are like, oh, well, that's not about environmental justice. And I'm like, well, you know, people can't fight for clean air if they don't have the right to vote, right? Or if they don't have the right to be in their homes, or if ICE is sitting outside of their school or their grocery store. So just thinking about community building as like a process of the wholeness of our community, and then working together, which is, there's no easy way and there's no fast way. And it demands that we understand the multiplicity of these different ways that we break down systemic oppression.
Yes. Thank you for that, Michelle. That was, and there's a lot, right? I think, Raquel, that you offered in that question or series of questions. There's a way that I can approach this with a few examples of my own work, as you've mentioned, in terms of how we're connected to the land, and then also what does it mean to hold this multifaceted identity, as well as the approach of the work now. And the core of it, as you mentioned, is, especially, for example, if you're a student or if you're someone taking that proverbial leap, how do you do that with a degree of confidence, if not at minimum, the space in which ensures that the whole of you will continue to be making change. So I'll say by this, in that, even as Michelle was mentioning this idea of different aspects of identity, and even as I hold a space for intersectionality, which again is to honor the work of Black and Brown scholars and educators, and especially Black women. So Kimberly Crenshaw, in case that's a name new to anybody, then definitely start there, because I think that honors those roots. And even for myself, when I moved coming to the United States, I was introduced to the idea of being bicultural, right? Because now all of a sudden, oh, okay, so now I'm navigating these new and different spaces, even as I'm continuing to learn about what my own identity is. Because a lot of growing up, a lot of the things around me were not affirming that being Mexican was good of any kind. So I was slowly learning to be ashamed of that, right? Or to not have any sense of pride or even value associated with that. That didn't come until college, in terms of which I could flip that to a bit and say, wait a minute, there are things that I can be proud of. Yes, there's still many things to deconstruct and undo and let go of. And that's different than just tossing it all away and then assimilating and being only to be, to only derive benefit from white association. And so that was a transition to be able to say that. I think as a key learning for others here is to really look at what you're rooting yourself in, and the set of values, because then you can move forward with that. And now I can more proudly, so to speak, pay attention and intentionally share aspects of my culture that I believe have these facets of growth of community, as Michelle's mentioning, right? That can provide paths forward. And even through this work, thinking about the land is acknowledging the multiple layers that move beyond the question of like, why don't Latinos care about the environment? And really say, well, that's a question of how do they care and how do we not know and support that? Because while yes, you can derive some of that from what you see, like saying, well, they're not present in these ways. Have you considered why those reasons might be, as well as maybe you're not missing the ways that they are present? Because a lot of the recent polls and surveys, even just within, I remember in graduate school looking for this data, and it just really wasn't there. There was a bit of pieces from it, but even just what we have in terms of the data between 2012 and now show that persistently communities of color, especially Black and Brown communities, consistently rank high, if not the highest, on care and concern for environmental issues, willingness to support, progressive policies on all of this stuff. And so if we say, if we have this as a high mark to say that care and concern and willingness to act is high, but the representation is low, I'm saying that's a different question then. Now we can look at systemically what's causing that disparity beyond just personal choice, that they don't want to. Because then, as Michelle mentions, well, then how is an oppressive structure and policy that manifests itself in ICE, then it's a factor of that, right? Rather than blaming the community for not showing up. So like, to me, that's where I began to do that work, and how I wanted to honor the work of environmental justice, which has to fight even for the most basic things like clean air, clean water, just a clean space in which to live and thrive. And say, how does that also include and extend to quote unquote natural resources, in the sense of access to these very landscapes that we, as you mentioned, Raquel, that we can easily talk about these faraway spaces that we invest millions of dollars to protect and secure, and we want communities to like care about it in the same way when we're not willing to do the same in those communities. And so that's for me the extension of this natural resources equity. And I hesitate to use justice unless we're actually going to do the work of justice, to be able to say systemically ensure that that has that sense of quote unquote ownership, right? Because they believe, they're willing to believe that you're actually will invest and support in that. And on the ground, for me, that has meant being able to show, even if it's programmatically on one outdoor experience, like a hike, to be able to show institutional partners like a park agency or district, what can that look like? Because you can do your, let's go out and talk about the trail, but if you're still following the same paradigm of like, I hold the expertise and I will teach it to you, communities that don't know, right? You just need to know better so that you can act differently or act better. I say, you're not changing. Now, if you flip it and be able to say, how do these communities hold value and knowledge and expertise of this space? in a way that this might be a new space for them, but connection to the land isn't new, and it isn't limited just to manual labor. And I remember this very clearly when I was leading a hike of families, and even as I was asking the parents, like, tell me, what do you notice and what do you see? And one of the dads who came in his tejana and botas and basically dressed for Sunday church, because what the flyer said was, come join us at the park for a family outing. Didn't say hike. Was like, all right, then I'm here with my family for this Sunday outing. And that was important for me to say, like, but you know what? But you're dressed in such a way that we can still do this safe and comfortably where we're going to do this. So you're not going to be shamed for not having the outdoor branded pants or the hat, like, because that's not the point. The point is, can we do this in a safe and comfortable way? And that he could identify so many of the plants along the way. And for me to say, like, you're a quote unquote natural naturalist, like, you're showing all of this. How do you know all of this? And he said, well, because I'm a landscaper. So to flip that, to be able to acknowledge, this is how inclusion as a practice, that means acknowledging that the table or the proverbial space will also need to change through that. Inclusion isn't just let's bring people into the broken and harmful system, as Michelle is noting, is that as we gain more awareness and ability to identify the systems of harm and oppression, right? That, whether we approach it from a lens of colonization or a reductionist mechanistic view of the land, whether that's also manifests itself through patriarchy. So through all of those, we're also looking at the flip side of what are we then creating differently. So if then we look at a life-affirming model that then has regenerative practices as a way, as Michelle said, that creates the spaces in which we can then thrive, and that we are balancing the way in which what we're fighting for in as much as what we're fighting against. Because if it all goes into fighting against, then we can burn out, we can wear ourselves out. So I'll close this by going to the question of said, so then what do you do, right? Because it sometimes seems like it's easy to say this, and then, oh, great, I'm going to walk out the door. And what does that mean? I would say three things. One of them is do the internal work to really get a sense of who are you, where are you, what does that healing work look like, knowing that it can be messy. How could you stand in any space and feel like who I am is amazing and that has value, because that's going to guide me, compared to why do I change so much of myself based on what I think others may think, or whether I have value in that space, because that can be an invitation to then pay attention to that, right? And maybe imposter syndrome, maybe like whatever you need to do that. So that's that first piece. The second piece then, to be able to say, what is the community that I can do this in? And that's really useful and important, because individual action matters a lot. And yet it's, as Michelle mentioned, the act of community building has so much power, not just because of the amount of change that it can do, but I think because also of the teachings and lessons of showing what it means to do this with others. And that's also what you need for movement building, because a lot of the collective culture is trying to push on you a toxic individualism, right? That's the only way to do change. Even when you look at even teaching movies, right? It's the one single amazing teacher that seems to change it all. But ask a bunch of teachers and be like, that's not how that works. Like everybody is doing that work. Why don't we have the movies of like the amazing group of teachers that's doing this together? So it's like paying attention to those things, how we can show community can be different. And then the last one, when it comes to institutional, is to acknowledge that different spaces can hold different spaces of power and privilege, but obviously that's relative in terms of what we're managing. What I mean here is those spaces, current spaces of power that need to be changed, and that can be changed from within, but that means you got to go in, I can say this with some humor, go in with the confidence of a mediocre white man that has all the belief that the system is designed for them and all they need to do is be in it and it changes. That's the same for you. And of course, I say this with apologies to any well-meaning white men in the audience, which is this isn't about you as an individual. It's about paying attention to the privileges in the space that allow you to do that. And then what you can do that as a in the practice of allyship and accompliceship. But I say this because for my own thing to say, if you join a board, is to be able to say that if you're only doing that for the purpose of self-promotion and benefit, that doesn't change the space. But if you can do it knowing that I am leveraging different things because what this institution can do that can impact more beyond me, that is something that you can pay attention to and ask us a question, because your time, your energy, regardless of who you are, has value and means something. And it can impact and web depending on the spaces that you are. Not everybody has to be an executive director to make that change, right? And it does matter if you're an executive director in many ways, right? Not everybody needs to be a board member of particular XYZ organizations to make the change. And it does matter in some cases if you use that. And not everybody needs to be the visible leader of a movement. And yet if you are, then that comes with responsibility. So those would be the things that I would say that for me has afforded a lot of learning to pay attention. What does it mean to do with what you have? But I think also to really figure out, who are you? Suffice to say. So I'll pause there.
So that's a lot. I mean, I'm just really smiling. I'm just smiling on the inside because, you've both brought up a lot of different ideas, for example, and I'm just going to tell this, I'm going to try to keep it really quick. It's a story that I heard at a training, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago. I was in the room with people from Action, Minnesota, and Minnesota Action, I think it is. Anyway, this lady got up, this beautiful Black woman, started to tell this story about a grant they got to do weatherization in their neighborhood. And they were hiring people to do outreach canvas. And this woman shows up and her resume is written not so well. And she didn't know anything about weatherization. And she just, she just was not polished, right? And she was sitting there and she was saying, like, going through the resumes and tossing out the ones that had a flaw in it. And I don't know what happened. She changed my life. In that moment, she said, oh my God, I'm replicating the thing I'm fighting. I'm creating this boundary. I'm keeping this woman from a job in her own neighborhood. And I always get teary-eyed when I think of that story, because she, as a Black woman, said, oh my God, the racism that I'm replicating, like that I'm shutting a door, and like the thoughts I'm having. And I just couldn't, I love that self-inquiry. And it began my journey into just really, before I examine even the external world, I'm going to examine my practices, right? What am I doing? Where do I sit? How do I talk to people? And so one of the things I want to do right now is ask everybody who's here with us in the room, most of the cameras are off except for us, is for you to remember a moment that you had tension. And maybe, I don't know if you want to put it in the chat. I think that a couple of things came up, Jose, when you were saying, what was the thing that you said that was just like, that we have to be like, sort of like disruptive, like you enter a space and you do it intentionally. And I think that we need to think about our own colonization. I say this all the time. People are like, is that a colonized you? Is that your colonized answer? Is that? And so I'm asking everybody in the room, like, has there been a moment where you were doing something that you didn't, like you were replicating something, or you were maybe needing to express power and had conflict, or, like there are moments where you have a real rupture in who am I with my friends, or there's a moment of tension where you are really having to think about what you value. And one of the things that you mentioned, Jose, was just how different communities value different ways. And I think that another moment of sort of disruption for people is, like another thing I would love for people to chime in, you should be participating with us, is, for example, when was the last time you said, I really want one of those? Was it a big house, or was it like, did you see a tree? Do you ever think that about nature? Like, I need to own that. So I know I have the privilege of watching people share a lot in Southwest Detroit. And just the other day we had, I don't know, maybe 30 volunteers walking around with us, cleaning up an alley. And I walked over an extension cord. And I could see the guys, they're probably from the suburbs, and they were looking at this extension cord, and they looked at this house, and they looked at that house, and they were realizing that they were sharing power, electricity. And I smiled and I said, isn't that beautiful? It was my moment to disrupt whatever thought they were having, which I'm assuming, and maybe that's bad, that it was negative, because you could just see the question. They were like, what's going on here? And I'm like, that's people taking care of people. Isn't that beautiful? How do you express your value? Michelle, you had an example earlier. Before people were jumping on, you said you thought you were on 2 panels, and you said, I need to step back, right? Because that's your way of lifting up someone else into the space. Because one of the things that we see, and I think we've all seen it in Detroit, first of all, you know, in 2007, as Michelle mentioned, 2005, 6, and 7, when my son was being born, we got hit, the economy got hit, the jobs went away. And there was a vacuum for a little while in the small business space and in jobs. And then we had this resurgence. We do that. And a lot of people flocked to Detroit, and they were these mostly white young business owners, and they could pitch really well. And they were getting all the grants, all the banks were giving them money. They were buying storefronts left and right. And I would be in, you know, I would go to these small business meetings, and then I would go to, you know, with my friends, and they would say, why can't we do that? And I'm like, because you don't take up the space, because we were not taught to take up the space, because it's a we, not an I. So it looked deficient, I think, in a facet to some people, but because there were not like these marathon running competition people, they were not like in front of the banks. And so I think I say all that to say that, you know, what happens with that we is that we keep sharing the space, and our representation looks different. And so I'm wondering, just, you know, I really would love to know what kinds of questions people have, if anything is resonating for you. If there's anything that you've learned or felt today, like, we really want you to chime in. Or do you have any questions, or we can just keep going? But I just really love the disruption. I'm a disruptor. I love it.
And may I offer a very quick paragraph reading that connects to kind of what I said, and hopefully offers a connection into what you're asking? I just sometimes I'm a fan of finding passages that remind me of things. I'll go ahead and share this here then. It's living our sacred purpose from La Cultura Cura. La Cultura Cura, by connecting with traditional culture, meets the needs of motivating one's actions to come from a deep love for your people, positive connection, and community. It posits that as a warrior, if you must fight, you do it from a place of love for your people, not from hatred of an enemy. With regard to how La Cultura Cura relates to transformative social change, Albino Garcia articulates the Quinto Soul model, which speaks of the 5 different realms of relationships. In the first, we journey deep inside ourselves to remember our true identities and connect with the original spark from the fire that we all come from. In the second, we exit the womb and address our familiar relationships in a good and steady way. You are allowed to step out your front door and enter the 3rd realm of community after your 1st and 2nd realms are in proper order. The 4th realm is the world created by man that includes institutional education and political entities. Finally, the 5th world, that of the spirit, is actually a culmination of the first precious 4. From this spiritual capacity is born. That's it.
That's beautiful. And I just, I'm wondering if anybody has thoughts. If not, then Dolores, do you have any questions?
I just wanted to open up the space to everybody since this is an open dialogue for any questions that you guys have for our panelists. We do have like questions obviously prepared, but we want to give the space now to individuals that may have questions or anything on their mind or anything that resonated, like even just stating something that resonated with you today that you would want to feel or you feel like you would like to share with the group. But our panelists are open to answering any and all questions. It doesn't have to relate directly to the environmental field, but anything related to even just being like a Latinx individual within this world. They're open to answering anything you guys are thinking about. And you guys feel free to unmute yourselves if you would want to ask a question as well to give that space, or if you feel more comfortable typing it, but you're also able to unmute yourself to ask a question.
We're waiting. So let's see. Go ahead.
Yeah. Buenas noches, buenas tardes, Jose. Gracias por compartir con nosotros. So my name's I'm Abraham. I'm actually a dual with C's and the business school. So Herb, I think when you were here, Jose. So yeah, my question is obviously born in Tijuana. I'm really tied to La Cultura, and the passage really spoke a lot to me. But then I'm also professionally interested in going to work in industry and business, and there's always this like clash, or it's pretty common for there to be a clash, between the two. And Michelle shared a great story earlier. As someone that wants to be on the other side but still support, like, what can business, or how do you think this help out? And I'm also, I'll leave it at that.
So I think I understand. How can business help? No, how can business be an ally in this work in general, or specifically with?
Maybe the individual level, like how can we continue to be an ally from the other side of it?
Got it. Okay, I think I understood, and then I'll add a quick note and then open it for whatever Michelle would like to add. I think that's a good question on two facets. One of them is, as Raquel was mentioned, it is taking time. It takes time and energy and effort to ensure that we don't perpetuate the same, we don't buy into the same systems that have caused harm, right? That we see this in the way that you see this, whether in the health and consumerism, that a lot of immigrant communities begin to acculturate in ways that are unhealthy. Whether you see this in the health component, that all of a sudden immigrant health gets worse, and it's like, and people say, how could that be? Isn't the quality of life getting better? No, we're like, capitalism is forcing and teaching them to like have unhealthy practices and access to food and whatnot. So we see those kind of things. And then and at the same time, what do we frame as advancement, right? To what do we see as making it? So I think being, as an example on the side of business, is now you have a stake in that. You have a role in that, because there may be many communities in which now they're looking to you as someone that's made it. And so now you get to define, what does that mean to have made it, right? So I'm conscious of that, because I don't want to portray like making it means now being exactly the thing that I want it to not be, right? And that can sting, because we always have these things of being vendido, like selling out, or like no longer, as if like we just, and anyways, that comes up with a lot of stuff. So for me, it's been, this is an example in which I will do the work to ensure that I don't perpetuate a dominant culture sense of either or thinking, or of binary outcomes, as Raquel mentioned. If we truly, for example, value fluidity and beyond the binary, I can do the work to show what does it mean to be both and. To be able to say, this is the success what it can mean to be successful. Like maybe you still are valuing home ownership, and I am not going to show home ownership in a way that's going to perpetuate a particular type, right? I'm going to show like, what does it mean to like now have made it in these different ways, as well as not perpetuating like toxic masculinity, right? Because then that can come up in the business culture that we're in through machismo and whatnot. So like those are some of those examples. So for me, it's you being able to say, ¿sabes qué? Vale to be able to do the extra work to show the both hand, porque the easy way is just to do the either or, right? Pues ni modo, like, look, this is what it means to make it. You know, I got money, so now I got to spend it. I'm like, no, like what are those lessons teaching you? Because abuelita in the rancho would tell you, I have everything I need here. So no quiero, it's like, I can hear that voice saying, si quieres porquerías, then that's what's going to come to you. So, but you can do different. Hope that helps. I don't want to overgeneralize it, but I think it's like, that's a real thing in terms of like in so many of our respective communities, what does it mean to quote unquote make it?
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for bringing the question, because I think that, grappling with our own privileges in being able to even have the thoughts, that that I have been able to come up with, and troubleshooting and thinking through and pondering and being quiet with these thoughts is even a privilege, right? That many of us in our own families are just like, oh yeah, like, or you could just go back to work, right? Like, or you could just wake up at 5 a.m. and start doing the thing like we've been doing, right? And I say that with like so much love, because some of my lifelong philosophers, right? I mean, my dad, for example, I come from an ironworking family, and welding and waking up at 5, 6 in the morning and going to work and working for long, long hours, and then coming out of it and saying, okay, at the end of the day, what is the values-based system that our family worked through? And it was, a commitment to each other, a commitment to the land, and a commitment to educating ourselves. And those were the mantras through which our family worked. And, holding that and saying that, what are the things that are bringing resilience to our community, no matter what role you are playing in our society, right? And I think that question has been the question that I always come back to, because even as I'm now in the Zoom class, right? That I don't mix in the daytime. I turn on my Zoom computer from the comfort of my own home, right? What am I doing today in my job that's helping build resilience? And I'll say that for my parents who weren't, didn't get to the master's degree, right? We're doing things with the capital that they gained, like helping other people think about purchasing homes, right? Thinking about how bringing a community together through small businesses, right? Bringing communities together and helping each other with visas, right? Just the multiplicity of different tasks that need to happen to allow our communities to be whole. I think when we're talking about business, you have to figure out where your own ethical threshold is. You have to figure out where the line is drawn, and that's very personal, right? And I have ideas, right, about policies. I have ideas about things that we need to do from a climate perspective, right, that will help build a greater global resiliency, right? And I think that's where that fight also happens, right? And so allowing ourselves to be in a position where we can use our privileges and access to power to raise that up is always, always the task, you know, and no matter what your positionality, right? And so I want to say that explicitly because we all hold the contradiction of standing on the lands that we stand on, right? We all hold that contradiction. So just being real with it and like constantly having that conversation and like be real with how other institutions are trying to play you, right? And I think that for me is like one of the hardest things because the system itself is built so that an individual cannot succeed, right? That there are boxes and boundaries to maintain the power structure.
When he wants a blanket.
And so just, you know, being real with, we can all easily be pawned as individuals, but collective power actually helps us disrupt the forces of tokenism. It disrupts the forces of selling out, right? It deconstructs these things so that we're being held laterally accountable to the people who we love and who we're trying to be in community with. So that's the non-answer.
No, that was super helpful. Gracias a los dos.
And I would also add just that, you know, with COVID and everything we've seen in the last 6 months, that every single industry is like innovating. Like you could come to an industry and say, do we have to do it like this? Like, you know, I think I've worked in small business and I have seen a lot of interest when companies are kind of like rebooting, right? Like they're like, we want to do this new thing. We think it's going to bring more jobs. We think we're going to do, you know, have like a better way to do things without having to have the impact that, you know, bad impact. And there's like I feel like the space is wide open. Like we didn't think we would be doing the things we're doing right now. Like we'd all be virtual. Even my sister, who's a super traditionalist, she was like, nobody has to work at the office anymore. It's stupid. I'm like, right. And so SDEV was okay because we had already been slightly remote because we're mostly a team of women. Some of us have children. And so it's like work from home. It doesn't make sense for you to get up, take your kids somewhere, come in, you know, and then leave early or leave in a hurry, the stress that causes on families. And so you really have the ability to look at an industry and say, is this the best way we can do this? Like, is this the best way that you know, we can treat people? And one of the things that we've done here in the last year, it'll be a year for me, is, you know, I'm the signer of things, but really decision making is like lateral. And it took us a while to get used to that, but you know, it just, yeah, you can see the power and the, you know, the hierarchy and colonialism in like policy, like the handbook. Like you can see it in the most minute, like, so even saying, I'm going to trust my employees. They're going to have, you know, like self-determination in the company. They're going to make their own schedules if they don't need to be doing this one thing. There's a lot of ways to rethink how to be in community, right? Even at work, and the community that you're in and the community that you hire. There's a lot of ways to do this work, you know, because I think I see this from Jessica Diaz. Like, I don't think that you have to pick one or the other. I think that there's always one of the things that I would always say is, you know, for example, Jessica, you get into whatever this job is, and then I always say it in this violent way, and people correct me, but I mean it, like infiltrate, turn around and kick the door down. Like get into this job that you love with biology of animals, turn around and then make sure that that others have access to that work, that you mentor people. And I would just say this, if there's any more questions, I'm going to say this. I had a really great mentor. I worked at a college for many years here in Detroit. His name is George Swan. I love saying his name. and he would like point at me from the hallway and he'd say, who's in your pipeline? Who are you talking to? Who are you mentoring? Who's going to replace you? And he just said that to me every day. And it took the fear of like holding on to my job and like being competitive. I actually wanted to replace myself. I was training people to take my job. And he did that for me. I mean, back in 96, I'm old. So, and so even now, you are all just beginning, but you should have that mindset already. You should already say, who am I taking with me? I have privilege. I'm in this school. I'm whatever, in whatever program. Am I talking to people and making sure that they know what I'm doing, that you know, that somebody else who's afraid of college or who's afraid of science or whatever, that you are walking them through this to get them on board and to take apart this fear, you know. And I'll just never forget that. Like, who's in your pipeline? And he'd say, don't tell me a first name. I want their first and last name. And I want to know, like, he just would really, really, really grill me. And so, you know, everything that we're talking about takes super, super intentionality. Yeah, super, super intentionality. And I just love this, like, turn around and kick the door down. Like, don't be nice. So it's 8:47. Are there any other questions?
I don't know if Jose or Michelle want to chime in to Jessica's question.
Yeah.
Sure, I think let me make sure that I don't misread it, which is, how do you hold both your environmental passions while feeling the responsibility of working to free your community? For example, being passionate about the biology of animals, but instead going into environmental justice field to fight for clean air for our community. It's a good question. And while honoring what we've said about it's not an either or, which I understand is a challenge, I think for me, that has meant, part of the question is when my parents saying, do my parents even know what I do? And for a time, it's like, no. For them, it's like, you're a teacher. That's close enough for us understanding to what it is. And that's also because I was an actual classroom teacher. So I said, I'm still doing that. It's just in much different ways and spaces. And I think in there, it's, the way that I have approached this has been thinking about how, no matter the space that I'm in, how, we sometimes say, how are your ancestors with you, as well as you being your ancestors' wildest dreams. But I think that's also your immediate family, in other words, of that which has provided guidance for you. How are they in those same spaces that you are? So that for me, it's a reminder about, like, well, what barriers may be there that would make this inaccessible to them in ways that is now accessible to me. So I say that as a way that we can totally nerd out and stoke on wildlife biology, because, in many ways, whether you're looking at the little amphibians in the pools, or the bears off in the distance, or even just how you're embracing the trees. I mean, like, to me, that in itself, and it's an invitation to both say, here's a particular way of sciencing that would allow me to know things about this. So I can study the tree, I can get this, natural resource management information and whatnot. And also be in a gifting relationship, kind of like Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer says in Braiding Sweetgrass. I mean, she is a professor, she is a scientist, and she is an indigenous practitioner of her cultural knowledge. So that breathing relationship with the tree now becomes also beautiful and fascinating because it's a community member. So I also add that layer of being with my parents as an example to be able to say, this is how they're present with me, and then how I bring those experiences to them, as well as how I can bring those experiences to that as well, which is not always easy, because even within my own parents, that's a challenge, right? Like, I don't hike or camp with them in the same way that I've done with other outings and programs. But what I can do is, because my dad is got employed at a nursery, and then he gets excited about bringing all these plants home and has set up this garden, do all this stuff, is I can ask him, tell me about that, Dad. Or why, or he loves to say like, check out this tree that I got. And he's like so excited. And I'm like, that's the same excitement that a scientist has. Tell me about it. Why is that really interesting and cool to you? And so like that can be one of those connections. But I just, it's more about, it goes back at minimum with more that reminder of what tells me. There's a difference between telling me I can no longer be myself in a space versus acknowledging what of me will manifest differently in a space. So this is why I didn't finish it earlier when I said I moved from being bicultural to being ambicultural, which means that I, just like being ambidextrous, now I can use both aspects of my different cultures' identity, to being quantum cultural. Just like quantum states, it can hold the multitudes of you, and what's going to collapse, in other words, who you're going to be, it's going to depend on the space of interaction, but it doesn't take away who you are. You're still all of you. And that's a way for me to remember that, and how even that family space, the parent space, can be a factor of that. And I can remind them of that. Dale, Michelle.
I don't know. I feel like quantum beings, like you just dropped the mic and I need to hang up the phone. Like watching you do that was amazing. Got the Aztec calendar in the background. Okay. Woo! That was good. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a really hard question because I feel like, I mean, hard in that like the way that the way, I mean, like our scholars, right? Like you all just got Kyle White, right? At Seas, and that's a huge addition. Dorsita Taylor, so many scholars. Rebecca Hardin, like the very construct of this idea of nature, right, was really tearing our humanity, right, out of creation, right? Tearing what it meant to be human from the rhythms of the earth, right? From what the seasons did, from the ways that we practiced our religion, our society, our governance, right? And put us into another category, human, in which we could manipulate nature, right? And so we, you know, I think the way that we're taught is asking us to compartmentalize our ways of thinking, and to say that, like, yeah, like that healing the relationship with your parents or your caregivers or your siblings or your neighbors or your grocer or your farmer, right? Like those relationships, healing and building those relationships are actually undoing that, right? They're undoing that that severance of our humanity from the rhythms of Earth's governance. And it's our challenge day in and day out to do that, you know. And there's no single answer, right? Like colonialism has damaged our brains and thinks that, you know, there's only really one way to do that, and that's by building capital, and capital will get us to that next phase. And that's the false promise, right? That's the yeah, that's the windmill, right, that we're always chasing. And it's actually the thing that's killing the earth, right? That's killing life on earth. And so again, just, you know, wow, like quantum beings, right? Like what you know, our Afrofuturists and our indigenous futurists are telling us is that, like, linear time is not the way that peoples have lived on this earth, right? And that even thinking about our ancestors and our future ancestors, right, in the ways that we're talking to them and saying, we fought as hard as we could to prevent the thing that we ourselves created so that you could have a life on this earth. and building that internal and spiritual resilience, right? That cultural resilience with the people around you, I think that is the work, right? And so there, when you start thinking like that, it's like there is no separation, right? Like there is no separation. And it just ends up providing and being in ways that you can't quantify, account for, or plan for, but will be the thing that you need when the next major climate disruption comes, right? And we can all count on that. We all know that's going to happen. We study it. We think we can account for it, but it will come. And what we will only have is, the relationships, right? That we have to keep us safe.
There was a question from Victoria where she says that she was accepted to UMICH's Masters of Social Work program, and she's thinking about going to a joint program with a MSW and a JD, and is applying to more schools out in California, but she's scared of the predominantly white institutions as a woman of color, but still wants to get in there and basically blow shit up. Do you have any advice for preparing / getting through a PWI?
That's a good question. I don't think I have a specific answer for the program, but I think of the process. For me, going from California to Michigan was my first time being in Michigan and living in Michigan for 2 years and experiencing even what an actual winter meant. But I will say 2 quick things, right? One of them, I used to joke that for my class, I was 30% of the LatinX representation. That meant there were 3 of us out of like a group of 100 or so, and that didn't count the international students. So it was first to be able to, as has been shared with you, is what does community mean for, and what does that mean? Because I remember during that first week, I had a call with one of my fellow friend Chicano teacher as well, and it's like, so, you know what I'm asking for? How's the representation out there? And I'm like, none. And I said, I'm going to go on campus and find the student groups. I want to see, because I can't be the only one feeling this. I want to see where people are gathering, and then what are they doing? So I began to do that, and knew that I had to look for that at different places in the school, and also in different places on the city. And that's why I needed to go to Ypsilanti for actual better Mexican food. It also meant, well, I needed to go to Detroit to find out where raza were and to be able to find those elements. I would say start with that. And then real quickly, the last one is, what are things that bring you joy in terms of facing campus? And for that, for me, was finding the comic book library in the upper campus. And then just spending so much time there reading my comic books instead of my homework articles.
Well, I will say that like my major strategy for being on campus is I worked restaurant jobs all through school, undergraduate and half of graduate school, and like food and people away from campus just helped me survive, right? I mean, because I was broke, right? And also like working at a restaurant fed me, but also because the institution itself, my philosophy for higher education is that there's a tendency to try to gnaw at your ego to make you feel like you're not smart enough, to try to make you work harder so that you can gain more privilege and prestige and competition within the university. And that tendency is specific to the university. And in the restaurant industry, it's not like that. People are not trying to like be the smartest, and you have to like, just find the space that makes you feel like the human that you are, right? And if that's student groups, comic books, restaurants, right? Like, I went to the YMCA every Thursday, every Saturday, and just swam, right? Like, those kinds of things. You just have to find the patterns that make you feel healthy and whole, because the institution itself will not provide that for you. You have to provide that for yourself, right?
So with that we're gonna close. It's been really amazing. I think it's being recorded, so Dolores will share the link. Maybe we'll also get the chat. So there's a lot of information in the chat, and she will send the link and she will post the link. And we've also posted our contact in the chat, and there's going to be a lot of thoughts, I hope. And if you want to reach out, there's a lot of training, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of books that it'll help you get on your, as Michelle said, it's a personal journey, and it takes a lot of intention.
Raquel, may I take 10 seconds to share a poem?
Absolutely.
Sorry, I want to share this because it's a poem that I wrote that I keep coming back to, and I think hopefully it finds relevant. It's in Spanish, so apologies for the Spanish speakers. We can send it and then have a friend translate it for you. ¿Y tú quién eres? Soy los sueños y memorias de mis antepasados, sueños de momentos aún no llegado, memorias que cargan historias del campo, del monte, de un horizonte lleno de esperanza, la adivinanza de qué eres si eres de aquí y de allá. Yo no soy menos, sino que soy más, porque mi cultura me guía como un compás. Thank you all.
That's beautiful.
Is that your poem? That's so good.
Yes, that's my poem.
That's great. Yeah, maybe you can email it and we can also share that. So I'm going to stop, and then I think Dolores is going to close us out. Right?
So Sean has a couple concluding announcements very quickly, and then I also would like to ask our panelists if you guys could stay on for a couple of minutes after, just to thank you guys for being here tonight, and any EVOR members that are able to join us after the meeting has ended. I'll stop recording, and if you guys could stay on after, that would be great. But Sean, do you want to handle the updates really quickly?
For sure. Before everyone goes, we want to share some actionable items that people can follow up on to promote positive social change related to environmental justice. These are not mandatory and they're only suggestions. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Wolverine MANRRS, and come to our next meeting October 12th about cooking with food scraps. And some action, and also check us out on our website at wolverinemannrs.wixsite.com. And
are there any actionable items that anybody can take?
And some actionable items that people can take is: 1, make sure to follow 3 environmental organizations or leaders on Instagram. 2, donate or give time to an environmental initiative and highlight it on social media with the hashtag Conchas and conversations. And 3, find, research, and sign 3 petitions regarding environmental justice.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming tonight. I'm going to stop the recording now, but thank you so much for coming and being a part of this open discussion. And I hope you guys learned as much as I did from all of our amazing panelists. So thank you all so much.